Hey, what's up? It's Ed Gallo here, Wrestling for MMA podcast, episode 5. I'm blowing through them. Yeah, last week I didn't really have anything specific to talk about, so I took your questions and I answered them for an hour and a half. You guys had a lot of questions, and I answered all of them, I think, so you're welcome for that. And yeah, we can do that again sometime, but for the uh, foreseeable future, I'll have some guests and specific topics planned. Without any MMA events or wrestling events, it's pretty tough to come up with stuff to talk about. So yeah, this week I got a pretty cool little feature lined up. So basically, backstory is one of our patrons, Kylan, who is I think Canadian. So I'm very appreciative that you ask wrestling questions, Kylan, because you're an MMA fan first and foremost, and you're just trying to expand your knowledge. So that's pretty cool. But yeah, so you've asked a couple wrestling questions. The one that you asked this week, I didn't know how to answer. It was a very scholarly question, and I didn't know. So my knowledge is pretty limited in some respects. So I reached out to my network of wrestling colleagues, wrestling comrades, and yeah, I found somebody who knows more than I do, who would be prepared to speak to this topic. Uh, so I would like to introduce my second ever guest. His name is Jack. You might recognize him on Twitter as at oldest greatest, and that's oldest and greatest is the handle there, and that's a nod to what wrestling is sometimes called. Uh, Perhaps truthfully, maybe we'll get into that because this is a history episode. But yeah, that is like about as much as I can say already. So Jack, welcome. Do you want to tell the people a little bit about yourself?
Hello, yeah, my name is Jack. I have a decent wrestling background. I grew up in the state of Michigan, got into wrestling in middle school, I guess, as sort of my first exposure to the sport, and then started really getting into it in high school. Wrestled for a college club team, been coaching and training a little bit since then. Uh, Started doing a little bit of analysis this past year. Had a lot of stuff planned for NCAAs that unfortunately didn't see the light of day after that tournament was canceled. So you probably haven't really seen my work at all, but hopefully there's going to be some stuff coming out in the future. And I'm here today to talk about wrestling in the olden days.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction. Jack's a very mysterious guy. We don't know a lot about him, but I do know
Yeah.
that he looks like Zack Sanders. Uh,
Well, my alt account at Sanders Zach has more followers right now than my main, which tells you everything you need to know.
Living a double life to
Yeah.
wrestle D1 and have a long and storied domestic freestyle career. It's a lot of commitment, a lot of energy put into that. So you might be a fan of Zack Sanders. You might know him better, yeah, in that sense. All right, cool. Let's jump right in. Let's jump right in. So I'm on my questions list. We get a lot of questions on Patreon, and honestly, it's been a real struggle to keep up with it because I think as a staff, we're procrastinators by
Yeah.
nature, and we have like 20 questions lined up within a week, and we're like, okay, we'll do them, and then
Yeah.
it's like a week left of the month, 3 months in a row, and we're like, oh, let's do them all now. So we've been trying to get more organized, and I swear that we talk about these things, and some of it takes work. So here's one that's been in the works for a while, and yeah, we're doing it. So here you go, Kylan. Kylan asks, uh, wrestling is kind of an old guard sport in the Olympics. How has Olympic wrestling changed since 1904? And what wrestlers and trainers would you consider the most influential? And he also says that we are great, and he rates the fight site a 5 out of 5. So thank you, Kylan. So Jack, what's your background knowledge on the history of wrestling, and then how would you approach this question?
Well, I have read the Wikipedia page for History of Wrestling.
Nice.
No, I've done a fair amount of watching, kind of old time stuff, whatever I can find on YouTube. And I know a decent about the history of the Olympics more generally, about kind of what went into the revival of the Olympics, the first modern Olympics in 1896, and how kind of the Olympic movement has gone and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. So he's kind of asking about 1904 on. Do you know what the actual details are of the wrestling that was held, like the
Yeah,
matches that
so
happened in the olden days, like ancient Greece, perhaps?
not really. It was not Greco-Roman as it's
Mm-hmm.
done today. Uh, they, I mean, there were various rule sets, so every society has had its own grappling traditions. There's a guy. His name's I think Ruin McFadden, and you'll never be able to spell it. So I don't know. You can search his thing is called like a hero of a thousand holds or something, but
Oh
it's
yeah,
about
yeah.
traditional grappling styles around the world. But basically, the rules were never standardized. But basically, the Greeks sometimes had submissions, sometimes had leg grabbing, uh, sometimes weren't even naked. They actually had pants. Uh, but early Olympic wrestling kind of started from partly the English and Irish wrestling traditions uh, that involved leg grabbing, and that kind of became freestyle. And then the wrestling started by like French soldiers in the 1800s, and that kind of became Greco. And they didn't have leg holds in that,
So I can
and
blame the
so
French for Greco.
yes.
Those jerks.
So in 1896 they had Greco. In 1900 they did not have wrestling, and so kind of the unbroken streak runs back from 1904. It was
Gotcha.
the first Olympics where they had wrestling and never lost it or whatever.
So I've decided, based on hearing that no wrestler from before the modern era would be able to hang with modern wrestlers just because the rules are so different and they probably didn't even like have the sport really figured out. Well, you can't prove
Right.
that, but
Yeah,
I don't
you're I think much more negative than I am about how confident they were in the olden days,
know. Mm-hmm.
about whether they actually knew how to wrestle at all, but we can get into that later. I
It's just
guess
like
I'll just
forgotten
keep.
knowledge, if so, right? Like if they actually were really, really good in ancient Greece, and like we have no idea what they were
Well,
doing.
I guess I meant in 1900.
Okay, gotcha. Oh,
Yeah,
they
I
were
have
good
no
in
idea how good
1900.
they were. I don't know. I have no idea how good they were before 1900, and then we can argue about whether they knew how to wrestle then or not.
That's the goal, is to time travel and wrestle Abe Lincoln, see what all the fuss was about.
Yeah,
He's supposed to be undefeated, but like what types of competitions was he competing in? Just like challenging guys around town.
yeah. So it was what they would have called freestyle or what became freestyle because there was leg grabbing. Usually, it was either you had to throw them or you had to pin them. And sometimes they allowed joint locks, and sometimes they had more or less mat wrestling.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it was all right. You didn't pin them, get back up, and sometimes the entire match was on the ground.
So it's interesting. That was like
But
older wrestling was a lot closer to submission grappling than wrestling is today.
yeah,
Like it's the sports kind of diverted. But yeah, I
right,
guess that tradition's still alive a bit with catch wrestling. Uh,
right.
and they still like hold catch wrestling
Hmm.
competitions. They're really hard to find,
Yeah,
but you could like go
yeah.
compete and like try to submit someone off your back and try not to get pinned at the same time. It's just kind of a fun
Yeah, but
idea.
I mean that was what the American style of wrestling was called, catch as catch can,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's kind of the direct ancestor of catch wrestling today.
Gotcha. Well, I'm jumping back and forth all over the place, so
Yeah.
I'll let you
Yeah, I guess I'll
go
continue the
off,
story of
King.
kind of Olympic wrestling. So
Mm-hmm.
I guess the part of it is the Olympics kind of weren't the pinnacle of athletics back then, where everyone trains in their sport and everyone knows that the goal in that sport is to make it to the Olympics. It was kind of more of like an exhibition thing, like, oh, let's have people from all over the world do these different sports. So, like, the 1904 Olympics was just the US Freestyle Championships. And then they were like, oh, we could also make this part of the Olympics. And so it was actually after all the other events and most people had left. And then they just took the AAU Freestyle Championships and just slapped the Olympic label on it. But it was all
Hmm.
American wrestlers in it.
Gotcha.
And so Greco, I think, was a little bit more developed back then, where they had European and World Championship matches in kind of the early 1900s, and most of those guys who were winning, most famous was George Hackenschmidt, didn't compete in the Olympics because they just didn't care. But matches were usually uh, first to pin, and so they could just go on forever. The Probably the worst thing in wrestling history was the 1912 final in Greco. Uh, they wrestled for 9 hours.
One match
Uh,
they wrestled for 9 hours.
yes, this
Oh
match
my god.
it took like 10 or 11 hours, but they would take breaks every 30 minutes, and so it was 9 hours of mat time, and then it got dark, and so the judges declared, "You both stink. You both lose. You both get the silver medal," and there was no gold.
That's
And
awesome.
so, and then speaking of judges, they said, okay, we can't have that anymore, and so they started using judges' decisions to decide matches that didn't end in a fall, in a
Mm-hmm.
pin. And so for up until 1960, it was just you wrestle for however long. If nobody gets a pin, then the judges decide. I don't know what the criteria were.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine there was a lot of controversy and a lot of,
A lot of racism.
yes.
That's wild. It's
Yeah,
so weird to think of
this is
that.
unrelated, but have you read the thing about Lee Kemp and the judges' decisions?
I read an article about a couple wrestlers. I don't think Lee Kemp was one of them, but it was like three or four wrestlers in the '60s, like protesting the coaches, and I forget who the coach was at the time, but yeah, they're all protesting unfair judges' decisions at the
Yeah,
Olympic trials or World Team trials or something like that. What happened with Lee Kemp?
he could have been the first four-time NCAA champ in the early '70s.
Mm-hmm.
He was a three-timer. In his freshman year in the finals, he lost. So in college, after overtime, they didn't do the tiebreaker rideouts.
Mm-hmm.
They eventually just went to decision because they had ties in college wrestling, but then when they got to the NCAA tournament, they're like, wait, we can't do a tie now. What? And so they would have judges' decisions, and he lost a decision in the NCAA finals his freshman year.
Gotcha.
And black wrestlers at NCAAs that year went like 0-8 or something in decisions.
Yikes.
Yeah.
Big yikes.
But
When did that
rest,
stop? When did they start doing points?
I don't know. I mean, they had in international they added points in like 1960, I think,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know when they got rid of ties and had just wrestle until we've settled this in college, probably in the '70s or '80s.
I feel like the only early college footage I've seen is from well, there's that one thread by I think it's by Catch Wrestling U on Twitter. They have one from the 30s, I believe, where it's some clips of like the mat wrestling that was going on there, and then Oklahoma State Athletics uploaded a few different NCAA championship finals streams, uh, and I believe There was one from 1956. I'm not sure, but the ones in the 60s, it was like 64, 66, 68.
Yeah.
Those had points. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, they added points in college wrestling in I think 1940 or something.
Okay, gotcha. So college was different than freestyle the whole
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
Gotcha. Makes sense. All right. So what happens next? I'm intrigued.
Uh, the Olympics started becoming more of a thing where more countries would participate, seen as kind of the pinnacle of sports. And so, more and more guys would try out for it. More countries would be in it. Uh, the American wrestlers had different rule set, but could do pretty well in freestyle. Didn't really try all that hard in Greco. I don't know where. I mean, this questioner is Canadian. I imagine most of the audience is American,
Yeah,
and
for
so
this
we're going to
podcast for
be,
sure.
yeah. It just seems like we're going to be a little more focused on U.S. wrestling, and it's not. We're not just going to look at the Olympic styles. We are going to mention collegiate style a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
and so the the wrestling looks a bit weird in the surviving footage. Up until the 1960s, they have this really wide stance with their
Right.
hands up really high. They don't seem to care all that much about protecting their legs. And then they kind of flurry and then they back up to 10 feet again with their arms out and go again. And then after 1960, wrestling really starts to get moving. Uh, the USSR became kind of the dominant wrestling nation. Iran and Turkey were also very good, but the USSR really took over in kind of the late 60s. Uh, and then starting in about the 70s, wrestling actually starts to look like they know how to wrestle, where they're hand fighting and they're taking leg attacks and they're scrambling. And then that kind of continues through the 80s. The pace gets a little bit faster. There's maybe a little more variety in technique. Mat wrestling was a bit bigger. Especially now, they don't give you as much time on the mat. If you go out of bounds, they always restart you on the feet instead of restarting you from parterre. In the present day, I think wrestling, the international styles of wrestling are great. Uh, it's exciting. There's obviously great technique, and it's fun to watch.
For
um,
sure.
the the question said something about which coaches and athletes have been the most influential or
Mm-hmm.
whatever.
For sure.
But I think the big thing is rule changes and equipment changes and things like that have had a much bigger impact on how wrestling has happened, what it's looked like, what the techniques have been, than any kind of innovation by coaches or anything.
I feel like strength and conditioning, progress in
Yeah.
that realm has been huge. I mean, our friend Bulldog is pretty high in the Soviet system for strength and conditioning, which I guess is probably somewhere in the
Mm-hmm.
60s 70s they
Yeah.
developed that whenever the USSR broke out. A lot of people say it's steroids, but I don't think they were like ahead of the game in terms of steroids at all. I don't know if you have any information on that subject, but
I don't. I remember on Malicious Intent one time they went into it, and Mike Mal thought it was pretty funny that the Soviet Union became kind of the dominant force in wrestling
mm-hmm.
right at the same time that anabolic steroids became available. But I'm not sure how much of it is that and how much of it was just part of a bigger system that they also just had a kind of a scientific approach to sports and they were,
Right. That's kind of what you
determined to
see
go with it.
with Japan today, just the benefits of having a system. And for them,
Yeah.
it's interesting because I feel like their system isn't just about the training; it's also about athlete development in a larger sense. Like they keep the same people slotted in
Yeah,
as starters from cadets to seniors. Is that right?
I think so. I don't know exactly how it goes, but yeah, basically it's much more about identifying the talent from a young age and
Mm-hmm.
working with those guys.
That would never work here.
Yeah.
Our athletes are too volatile. I don't know what it is, but there's so much. It's so unpredictable who's going to be good or not. Um, like you'll look back and someone's multiple time NCAA champion. You'll look back to their youth days and oh look they're great. Then you look at those same tournaments and like the people who are winning like Reno Worlds all the time when they're kids. Like it's totally up in the air who pans out or not. So yeah, I kind of sometimes wish the U.S. had more of a system, but the wild nature of and it's a huge country obviously, and people go like, "Oh, how does Russia do it?" Like, well, most of their athletes are in a very small area, whereas in the United States, it's pretty spread out, and we're pretty competitive amongst ourselves, which probably hurts that side of things. Although I think it overall raises the level of the
Well, we
athletes that we
also, I
have there.
think, have better opportunities for guys who aren't at the top at a young
Mm-hmm.
age to
Oh, for sure,
keep wrestling,
for sure.
where you don't get weeded out if you don't make a cadet team or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you don't have to go transfer to Hungary if you don't
Yeah.
if you don't think you're gonna make it. Yeah, that's like a whole wild thing too. If you want to talk about like one of the most recent development, not recent, but like actual modern developments that's changed the sport, is the breakup of the USSR. Because before you had all
Yeah,
those
for sure.
territories, one spot that everyone's fighting for. Now you have Russians wrestling for a dozen different countries, and they're all in your weight. You
Right.
have to beat all of them. It's like I forget who it was. It wasn't Jordan Burroughs this past World Championships? He had like 5 Russians in a row, something crazy like
Oh
that.
yeah.
Like everyone he wrestled was from Dagestan.
I think in 2017 he had like Shabanov, he had Kajiev, he had I forget who, but a bunch of Russian transfers or
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's Russian
people born in
transfers
Russia.
plus the natives of former Soviet territories like Georgia and sometimes Azerbaijan. The guys are actually Azeri. Sometimes Kazakhstan. They're actually Kazakh. Like stuff like that. It's just so overwhelmingly more difficult, I think, to win at that level than it was pre
Yeah,
uh,
for sure, and harder to
breakup.
medal.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, that all I forget the exact numbers, but in 2019 at the World Championships, uh, Russian transfers had the same number of medals in freestyle as the United States did across all 3 styles.
Yeah.
So it's unfair, but we could be doing the same thing. We just I'm sure it's difficult to get transfers going, but I mean, there's nothing stopping Americans really from doing the same thing and representing a bunch of different countries. And some guys do it, and they're all Cliff Keen guys for the most part. But that could be, you know, a big jump in competition is if Americans start doing that more often as well. Like 57 is so much tougher because Miocic wrestles for Serbia. That was a big
Hmm.
deal. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess one of the biggest changes we can talk about what wrestling sort of was like in the olden times. So very slow pace, which
Mm-hmm.
makes sense when you realize the match might last 2 hours. Uh, very kind of, I don't know, slappy. They kind of just swing their hands out, but they don't push and pull all that much.
Like unintentional hand fighting. She's like, I'm just gonna be
Yeah,
annoying.
yeah. I mean, you know how like if you see like middle school wrestlers who don't really know what they're doing with hand fighting,
Mm-hmm.
but they see everyone else do it, so they kind of wave their arms around until one of them dives for a leg.
Gotcha. So you're saying that middle schoolers today would beat or be competitive with NCAA champions of old?
They give them a match,
Yeah, they'd give them a tough match. I know some good middle school kids that give them a run.
but it's hard to know how much of that is they were just dumb and bad, and how much of it is they're actually just responding to the conditions they're in. So the mat was made out of canvas and horsehair in those days, so
Yikes.
it's actually hard to shoot. And the first Resolite mats, the sort of modern surface that you can slide on, came out in the '60s, and it's right around then that we see athletes like actually taking consistent leg attacks and actually defending their legs. And so you can kind of see, oh, as soon as the equipment changes, the wrestling changes. You could
Mm-hmm.
also, I think, choke them a lot more in front headlocks, and do kind of nasty things.
You still can if the refs like you. Like if you're Tobier, you can get
Yeah,
away with it.
yeah, but I mean, it. I think being put in a front headlock was a lot worse back then. Where now, you're more worried about protecting your legs and about getting your head pulled down. I think back then it was probably the other way around. Um, I'm not sure if they had stalemates, where now if you're kind of stuck in a position for more than a few seconds, the rest will stop it. In Ed Gallagher's book, he was the coach of Oklahoma State in like the 1920s through the 40s or something. He wrote a wrestling technique book, and there's one part where he says, if the guy's really strong, what you should do is do I don't know, he calls it the scissor hold or something. But if you look at the picture, it's just a body triangle.
Nice.
He says, squeeze them in here for 2 or 3 minutes, and then they'll get tired and you can pin them. And so I think there was a lot of, all right, just get a good position and then just hold them and choke them as long as you possibly can.
So it was jujitsu a little bit. That's really
A
funny.
little bit, yeah.
I saw those. I saw that GIF thread of like 30s NCAA's, and I'm like, wow, this is
Yeah.
just straight up grappling. This is not wrestling at all. Well, it
Yeah.
is
I mean,
wrestling, but
if
not
you
modern.
watch grappling, their stance is so much more upright, and so they're leaning back so much farther.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see that in the guy's stances back then. Is it looks goofy, and it looks like you would just low single them really easily, but it makes
Gotcha.
sense that they're protecting what they felt like they needed to protect.
When you were doing this research and looking at these matches, did anyone like stand out to you as like, yeah, this guy is legit?
Not really,
Oh,
partly because I couldn't tell who was who.
mm,
It would just be an hour of you know Oklahoma versus Oklahoma and A&M, and I can't tell who the wrestlers are,
right.
and you don't get to see anybody more than once. Uh, I mean, if we want to talk about influential athletes and trainers,
For
I
sure.
think Ed Gallagher is one of them in the U.S. at least in terms of trying to be scientific about it and trying to have kind of a curriculum, kind of having like a fixed list of moves, saying, all right, these are the moves everybody needs to know, everybody should work on, and sort of the professional, not professionalization, but the kind of taking the sport seriously and being systematic with your nutrition and with your training.
Mm-hmm. Was Ed Gallagher a teacher?
I don't know. He was the coach for Oklahoma State
Gotcha.
for
I'm just wondering
most
what
of
his
their early
background is that he
days.
would bring that in. You know, like where does that come from?
Yeah, I don't remember.
I have a funny story. I don't know when it happened, but it's about Cornell wrestling. A buddy of mine, his like great grandfather, his grandfather, I don't know what it is. Somebody he's descended from, uh, was one of the first coaches for Cornell, and I have no idea how he got into that
This is
position.
Cornell College in Iowa or Cornell
This
in New
is
York.
university,
Okay,
whatever it was called at that point.
yeah,
Um, but yeah, they put him in charge of the wrestling team, and he did not know how to wrestle, and he had never wrestled before, but he had guys on the team. So basically, he would just he I guess he heard from somebody like what you're supposed to do, and he would just have the wrestlers demonstrate things for him, and then he would learn them, and then he would teach them, and then like basically had the wrestlers teaching each other, and they became super successful super quickly. So like there, I think it was like had to have been pre 1950 at that point.
yeah,
But yeah, I think that just shows where the sport was at in the United States, at least at that point, where basically any concerted effort to make changes on a systemic level or like implement any sort of plan would be successful because no one was really taking it that seriously. It's so
Yeah,
interesting to think about considering how like psychotic um, the programming is for these teams now.
yeah. But in the 1960s, things kind of really took off. The 1960 Olympics, there's actually a decent amount of footage, so it's the first time you can see a bunch of wrestlers from the same time and see, okay, this is kind of what wrestling was like.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really that it's like somebody in like a TV fitness class where you know how like there'll be like a woman doing squats with like a really wide stance
Right.
and she'll have her arms pointed straight out in front of her. That kind of was their wrestling stance, and they just kind of go at each other. And then the thing is, when they would get in a position, you know, like if somebody got it to a single leg, it looks okay. It looks like they're actually wrestling. It's just kind of the in between and the setups
Gotcha.
that just looks really bizarre.
The entry game.
Yeah, and I guess it makes sense that the pace was lower. There was no step out rule. There was, I think, not as much, as many restrictions on stalling and fleeing. And so it's kind of, all right, well, maybe I'll try this one. All right, let's stop and think about what to do next. I'll try this one. No. And it was kind of these flurries and then they reset for 15 seconds.
So
But
when
then
you see
in
that, do you take like in context when somebody like Uitake has three NCAA championships and two Olympic medals and is undefeated? Do you look at that differently now after seeing that footage?
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, because
I mean, the
you
thing
have to
is
be a
like,
level above, but at the same time, what is that level?
yeah, I mean they had those same limitations in terms of it would hurt to shoot. You know,
Mm-hmm.
your knees would get chewed up, and you probably couldn't slide that quickly on the mat.
Different sport
Um,
for sure.
yeah, but the '60s is when it kind of starts to take off.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think
Where
that is? Like, what spurred the change?
I don't know for sure. I think part of it is the Resolite mats.
Mm-hmm.
I think part of it is, especially at the international level, uh, countries and especially the Soviet Union starting to take it seriously and kind of train methodically.
Mm-hmm.
Where if you watch it matches from the '70s, all of a sudden it looks like, oh wait, now they learned how to wrestle. Like in I guess 16 years from 1960 to '76, it's a completely different sport. And
So
it seems like the biggest change has to be the mat.
yeah, here's my hypothesis. Maybe what you're saying it's because the Soviet Union got good first, and then we noticed it, and then it was Cold War influence of trying to catch up and try and take it seriously as well, just so they don't like completely dominate us. Because that is a thing that like for a foreign nation to get really good at, that is kind of a scary thing. Where it's like boxing and wrestling is like them being good at fighting. Like they're getting good at fighting a lot faster than we are, and there's more of them and stuff like that. So maybe that fear
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm
kick-started
not
it.
sure how much it went that way that the U.S. would have responded because we don't have kind of the government infrastructure for sports.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it might have been the other way where the
Psychologically, you know what I
Soviets
mean?
are well, the Soviets are going, okay, we need to prove ourselves in fighting. Why aren't we number one in the world in wrestling?
Right.
We got to step this up.
In this competition, the level raised and
Yeah,
everyone adjusted.
yeah,
Yeah. So maybe a more not at all what
mm-hmm.
I'm saying, but just that someone got good first, and
Yeah.
this is why they did it, and then the level just went up from there.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of how it goes usually. That makes sense. So in terms of takeaways, did you learn anything interesting that
Yeah.
you'll
Well,
share in
I
the future
think
with people?
uh, I'm not sure how much of this was Gable, but they really start to push a lot more. There's way less in between where they're basically in constant contact now, starting in the 70s, 80s, and they get. I do you know when the step out rule started?
In folk,
No, in,
like when push outs
in
became a point.
yeah.
Oh no, I have no idea.
Okay, yeah. I just wondering because I can't tell exactly when it happens, but there's clearly guys are fighting to control the center a lot more, and I think the step out rule has a lot to do with it.
Hmm.
Where if it's a point to go out of bounds, suddenly you fight to stay in the center a lot harder.
Now in
Because
college, they implemented, just for context for everyone else, in college they just implemented a. So in college, it's not a point if you step out, but in the past, it would lead to stall calls eventually if you just kept going out of bounds. So they changed it where it's this really subjective rule about who's you know initiating and who's trying to retain center on the mat. So if someone just straight pushes you out, they get hit for stalling, and two stall warnings is a point, so it's like a half push out. But that's actually encouraged people to go to the edge because now they can try to game it and make it seem like you went out on purpose or they pushed you out or something like that. So it's when it's more cut and dry of who did what. It's a lot different. But yeah, I just wanted to point that out, like the opposite effect happening when the rule is kind of butchered.
yeah, and because one thing that still happens in the 1970s and 80s is one guy will be sort of taking all the forward steps, and the other guy's just kind of backing up the whole match.
Mm-hmm.
And they both know how to wrestle, and when they get into flurries, it's pretty evenly matched. But it was just kind of a valid strategy was you could retreat, and that's kind of not there anymore.
Mm-hmm. That's got to be so much harder to score on people if they're backing away
Yeah,
from you the whole time.
yeah.
Gotcha. Gotcha. I actually wanted to switch gears a little bit, do some fun questions. Did you have any like major insights that you wanted to share before we change topics a little bit?
No, I guess the general point that the biggest changes have been from rule changes and kind of equipment changes than guys figuring out new moves.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we'll do a sequel where you talk about all the changes that have happened in the past like 20 years in freestyle because like they've gone through a bunch of different iterations of the rule set
Yeah,
since then. That's a whole different
yeah.
can of worms. So let's not even go into it yet because it'd take too much time. Okay, so Jack, here's two fun things to talk about. Eventually, I think I'm gonna like steal from Jason Bryant and do like short time questions at the end, but I'm not ready for that yet.
All
But
right.
eventually, we'll do fun things. But this is kind of enjoyable as well. So you are obviously a big fan of wrestling and a wrestler, and you study the sport. Do you have a similar relationship with mixed martial arts? I've seen you tweet about MMA before, so.
Yeah, a bit. I'm definitely not nearly as into it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't know why. I can't really bring myself to watch old MMA.
Old MMA is hard.
I think it's not just the pace though. It's that I don't care about it all that much,
Mm-hmm.
and
But
I
you
feel
watch
like with
events when
rest,
they're on, like nowadays.
yeah. But
Gotcha.
like, if there's something I missed, I'm not gonna go back and watch it.
For sure. Well, you don't need to
Whereas
have a ton of
yeah.
information to answer these questions. So I
Okay,
got two
okay, yeah.
questions. So here's my first question. This one will be easier. Uh, you don't have to pick your favorite wrestler competing today or in the past, but just pick a wrestler either from today or from the past that you really enjoy, and just share a couple things about their game and why it works, and just kind of share them with the world. You don't have to. It doesn't have to be super in depth. Just the basics.
All right. Our son Fadzaev, from Russia or Soviet Union or whatever in the 80s, was one of the first Russians to be a committed leg attacker, where a lot of the successful Russians are good because of their counters, where they kind of just wait around and they'll let the other guy shoot. They'll look for their pass bys and their arm drags, and they're good from parterre. And Fadzaev was always looking to take people down and do attack single legs. and he was, working to score the whole time, whereas it seems like a lot of other guys kind of just wait for positions to happen and try and score from there.
Hmm.
And so I always enjoy watching him.
Fun that you bring him up because Ryan is still working on it. I don't know how close he is to finishing it, but Ryan's doing a video breakdown analysis of Fedzaya for the series that we're doing. So when
Oh,
I wrote
nice.
that Mitsisuri article and the
Uh
Taylor
huh.
Romani video, it's all part of that series. So
Oh,
I
he's
will.
the all time great in that.
Yeah, he's the all-time
Oh, that's
great.
cool.
So that'll be cool. Yeah, so I'm gonna tell Ryan to listen to this part just in case he picks up any new insights there. Um, yeah, and I hope he hits up Guru Archives because that guy's got some old Fedzayev footage that I'm not sure it's easy to find. It's like the footage became a lot more available in the 90s, but the
Yeah,
90s are like the end of Fedzayev's time at the top, and like I wish I could see the stuff from the 80s.
there's this YouTube channel. It's like, well, it's in Russian, but I think it's Vladimir Chelnakov.
Hmm.
He's got tons and tons of wrestling from the 70s and 80s and 90s.
Got you. I will check that out because I like as much as I trash old old
Yeah.
sports. I do like to see it because then I love to be pleasantly surprised when I go back and I see something that is actually good and holds up or like teaches me something new. That's always fun. I
Mm-hmm.
had that recently with Mike Brown from 2 episodes ago when
Mm-hmm.
I went back and watched it. And it wasn't that old, but like 2004 lightweight MMA. Like this is pretty good. They
Yeah.
are not bad. So
I
that's
mean,
always
I
a good
think
time.
the good guys actually hold up pretty well. It's the not quite as top
Hmm.
tier guys that really age poorly.
It just wasn't nearly as deep, um,
Yeah.
which speaks to how they might
Mm-hmm.
have done if competition was steeper. But it is what it
Right.
is. Cool. So similar question for mixed martial arts, and you could take this two ways. You could just do a fighter overall who you like who does cool things, or you could do a fighter who's wrestling in MMA you like and they do cool things. And that might be one and the same.
Ooh. Uh, I like Johnny Hendrix's kind of short range game
Mm-hmm.
where Connor Rebush of Heavy Hands had an article about how people were saying, "Oh, how come Johnny Hendrix isn't a good wrestler? How come he doesn't wrestle in the cage?" It's like, well, he is. It's just he's not doing a blast double. He's
Right.
pulling your head down and he's pushing your elbow and stuff.
Like short offense for MMA,
Yeah,
more or
where it's,
less
yeah,
hand fighting.
it's pulling your head down to an elbow and it's working hands to hit a knee.
In a way, it might be like a symptom of his personality where like maybe he doesn't want to work as hard as he has to in the fight.
I
He's
don't
like,
know.
well,
I think it's more his skill set though that he just wasn't an explosive takedown kind of guy.
gotcha. Yeah, I never watched his college matches. I don't know why. Like, I'm sure I've seen them
Yeah,
before from various sources, but I've never like sat down and studied how he wrestled. And they asked me about that when I was on the podcast. I'm like, well, I don't know how he
yeah.
wrestled, but
I mean, it's like if you had like Brandon Sorensen trying to do MMA, he
oh
wouldn't
god.
be Chad Mendez.
Also, big ups, Brandon Sorensen's in remission,
Yeah, that's good to hear.
so that's awesome. Yeah, he would not be Chad Mendes. Only Chad Mendes can be Chad Mendes. It's funny. You watch people who are like super explosive leg attackers in MMA, and you go back and watch their college footage, and it's not always like that because I mean the opportunities for leg attacks are so different.
Right,
That maybe someone had that in their back pocket the whole time, but they just never had someone running straight at them like they
right,
would in
yeah,
an MMA fight. So it's like he was all front headlock and he was all like short,
yeah. Well,
drops to the
he
ankle.
also wrestled at 25,
Right.
where he was kind of big for the weight, and then he
Mm-hmm.
went up, and now he's small for the weight, and it's
Yeah.
different.
From 25 to 41. Cool. All right. Well, those are good answers, and I like that you had good answers even when I didn't prep you for that because I just thought of that in the past like 5 minutes.
Oh,
Um,
nice.
but yeah, so this is the episode. We can definitely do more in the future, more history. But Kylan, I hope that is a suitable answer to your question, and maybe not next week, but sometime soon. And I'm just gonna put Ben Cohn on the spot here. So Ben Cohn said he can get me Tatiana Suarez on the podcast.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so
That'd be amazing.
almost a top contender in the women's strawweight division in the UFC, and she was relatively high on the freestyle ladder for women's freestyle in the U.S. So uh, she might have made national teams before, if I'm correct.
I think she did. Yeah, she was third on the ladder.
Yeah, but we're gonna talk to her at some point because Ben interviewed Stephen Wright, who was Johnny Hendricks' striking coach a little bit, and I believe he worked with like Team Takedown and a lot of those guys that trained with Mark Lehman, and I think Suarez has some connection there. So Ben said he can make that happen, and he will also be there. So that might be the next episode. That might be 2 or 3 down the line, but it'll happen. And Richard Mann also said he would do the show, and then he forgot about it or something. So I got plans for future episodes, but yeah, I'm just gonna throw out a bunch of false promises, like how I said I was gonna do the Mike Brown article, and then I made all the clips and I did the podcast, and then I still haven't written it because writing is hard. But yeah, all right. Jack, do you have anything to plug?
No, just if we're doing false promises, I will be getting Jordan Burroughs on this podcast next week.
Oh.
So stay tuned.
I do have his number, but I've never used it. So maybe that'll happen someday. Talk to Jordan Burroughs about pretending that he's going to do MMA and then not doing it for the 100th time.
He's never going to do it.
It's not going to happen. All right. Well, that's the podcast. This is one of the ones where in my head I was like, this will be shorter, and it was still like 45 minutes, but this is short for me, and I like it. So yeah. If you like this content, you want to ask your own questions or get more things from me, definitely subscribe on Patreon. Really, any donation will be good because you just have to get on the page, and I have a bunch of content there that's just for patrons. And then if I do, block it by tier, I really don't do anything that isn't accessible to the $5 patrons, which is everybody in the Discord server. So recommend signing up for that. I do, you can do your podcast requests, but you can also get access to commentary videos. I'll just like watch matches and commentate them and do things of that nature. So if you like that, check it out, and maybe I'll put one out for free sometime soon, and you can get an idea of what that's like. Okie dokie. Thank you, Jack. That was awesome. You're a very smart man, and it's really impressive that you found the time to do that research while also like moonlighting as Zach Sanders. So yeah, see.
Yeah, well, I mean, the storm practices are shut down now, so.
Oh, that's true. You have a lot of time in your hands.
Yeah.
Yeah. So once competition starts back up, you'll be busy. All right.
Yeah.
Cool.
Back to retweeting Minnesota recruiting news.
Have fun with it. All right. Later, world.